We're going to jump in to the verses of the Malkhuyot section of the Musaf Hamida on Rosh Hashanah. As we mentioned yesterday, there's a consensus that the minimum number of verses that you need to recite for Malkhuyot is 10. And the order, at least according to the Mishnah, is that you're supposed to start with Torah, umashlim banavi, and finish with Navi. But we actually have a practice of finishing with Torah. So we have to find 3 verses of Torah, 3 verses of Nevi'im, and 3 verses from Ketuvim. All the Ketuvim come from Psalms. And then we have to finish with a verse from Torah. As we'll see, that's a little bit of a difficult prospect because there are very few verses in Torah that refer to God as king. But the one that we're going to look at today is the first one that comes in order of the Torah that refers to God as king quite unambiguously, and that's at the end of Shirat Hayam, at the end of the Song of the Sea, when Bnei Yisrael says, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. How we translate that is a little bit at issue, but let's say for now, Adonai will rule or rules forever and ever. So what we see is that at the end of the Song of the Sea, there, verse 17 and verse 18, almost all of the versions of the Machzor that we have today just quote verse 18, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. But there were older versions, and we'll look at this as we move throughout these verses, other versions of the verses in Malkhuyot that actually brought the verse before it. So we'll read it just to give honor to that tradition as well. Tivi'emo v'tita'emo bahar nachalatcha. You will bring them and plant them in your own mountain. Machon l'shivtacha pa'alta Adonai, the place you made to dwell in, O Lord. Mikdash Adonai konenu yadecha, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands establish. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. So it seems like when God rules, there's also a place for God to rule from, which is the Mikdash, which is sort of a foreshadowing that shows up in the moment of the Bnei Israel crossing the sea. And the culmination of the song, verse 18, not unnoticed by Chazal. There were 18 verses in Song of the Sea and 18 brachot in the Amidah. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, the culmination verse is God shall be king forever and ever. Now there is a critique of Bnei Israel that's embedded in this verse in one midrashic tradition, and we're going to look at that just for a second because I think it's interesting that it's there. But also we're going to look at the way in which, basically through Shir HaShirim, through the love song that is Song of Songs, we're going to see how this verse is interpreted, and it might be a little bit of a different valence of what we think of God as ruling, and that's what I'm going to offer for us today. So just, first of all, the critique. We have in the Mechilta, in the early Midrash on the book of Exodus, Rabbi Yossi Aglili said, had Israel said, Adonai, ilu amru Yisrael al hayam, Adonai melech leolam va'ed, or melech olam va'ed, God is king, Adonai melech, as opposed to Adonai yimloch, then no nation or tongue could have ruled over them. They would have been sort of invincible if they were willing to accept God's kingship in the present. But they said, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed, God will rule forever and ever, la'atid lavo, only in the future and not right now. And this is actually one of the difficulties in what it means to call God king. Is God king now, or is God king only in the future? Like in the Kaddish we say, God, may God rule. So is God ruling now? So this midrash seems to indicate that Bnei Israel wasn't willing to accept God right now. Otherwise they would have said Adonai Melech. They were willing to crown God in the future, Adonai Yimloch. And that's sort of a critique against Bnei Israel. But that's not the valence, I think, that we want to recall on Rosh Hashanah, although it would a little bit be daring if it was. But this is the part I want to look at, which is from Shir HaShirim, from a verse, Hasebi einayich minegdi shehem hir hivuni, a little bit of a difficult verse. JPS translates, turn your eyes, einayich, but we'll see the Midrash is going to play with that word. Turn your eyes, einayich, away from me, for they overwhelm me. Okay, now Chazal builds this into a midrash that is quite poignant, I think, and they're going to play on the word einayich and ta'anit. You can see they have sort of the same root. The einayich, which means your eye, and ta'aniyot, the fasts, have some similar letters, and that's what they're going to play out. So, Hasebi einayich, turn your eyes away from me. Rabbi Azariah said in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Simon, this is like a king who got angry with his spouse, Matrona, and cast her out from the palace. What did she do? she hid her face behind a column outside the palace. Okay, so she's cast out of the palace, but she doesn't fully banish herself. She hangs out outside the palace and hides behind a column, presumably to have the following encounter. When the king passed the column, he said, "Take her away from my face, for it is too hard for me to see her." Right? The king sort of sends away the lover, but when confronted with the lover, even in the anger, can't stand seeing her because he is still drawn to her, and therefore has to ask that she be taken away because it's too hard for the king to look on to the matrona. So too, when the court sits and declares a fast, taniyot, like Inayach, and people fast, the Holy Blessed One says, "It's too hard for me. Hirhivuni, they overwhelm me. They cause me to act in the world and proclaim kingship." Okay, so this is God saying, even though you've sinned, when I see you and I see you fasting, that's what's going to overwhelm me. And nevertheless, I can't resist you. And when the court declares a fast and the kids fast, apparently a tradition in some Jewish communities in the past, the Holy Blessed One said, "It's too hard for me. They overwhelm me. They were the ones who made me king and said, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. Hem himlichuni aleihem ve'amru Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed." God remembers this moment at the sea, a sort of lover moment when Bnei Israel and God fall in love with each other. And the pinnacle of that moment is when Bnei Israel says to God, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. And God sort of sees this as the declaration of love and relationship, that when God later gets angry and banishes us, as it were, when we say that, God is reminded of the initial love and relationship and says, "I can't. It's overwhelming me. I can't reject them forever. Like I have to. If I really want to stay mad at them, you have to help me because when they say that, it draws me back to them." So in this understanding, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed is a memory that we recall that is sort of an irresistible memory for God, where we, in this moment of love at the sea, when God sort of saw to our safe passage, was able to begin the relationship with us. And when we crown God, that's our contribution to that relationship. This is played out a little bit in a couple other midrashim that we'll end with today, also from Shir HaShirim. It's interesting that this verse, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, gets sort of used in the interpretation of the love poem between God and the Jewish people. Hinach yafa ra'ayati, hinach yafa einayich yonim. Ra'ayati, the midrash is going to play on the idea of ra'ayati. First, they start with hinach yafa. You are so beautiful, you are fair. Israel is loved because in every place that Israel praised God, the language doubled. Israel said, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, and God said, I also wrote this about you. I also called you a king. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Atem tihyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. So the sort of the doubling of the image of the crowning. We often think of Rosh Hashanah as the crowning of God. That's what most of the poems in Malkhuyot are about, the Jewish people crowning God. But this midrash makes clear that there's a little bit of a two-way street here. We say Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, and God says, Atem tihyu li mamlechet kohanim. You will also be a kingdom of priests to me. So there's this sort of idealized relationship on both sides. We are the ones who call God king and want God to be king. And God also calls us kings, even though we are, maybe not worthy of the title. You could maybe extend that both ways. Nevertheless, in this moment, we're calling each other kingly. And that's part of the sort of rejuvenation of this relationship, which is the kickoff verse of our verses in Malkhuyot. I'm going to end with this last midrash, also from Shir HaShirim. Ani yeshena v'li bi'er kol dodi dofek, pidchi li achoti ra'ayati. Right? Let me in. There's a knock on the door. Let me in. My darling, ra'ayati. My darling, ra'ayati. Ra'ayati bayam. When were we God's lover? When was God our lover? At the sea. Shenitra'uli. That's when they loved me. They're playing off the word ra'aya. that they loved me at the sea, and they said, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. They became my re'ah, they became my lover at the sea. Although you could also perhaps see in the nitra'u, in the word nitra'u, the word truah, which is the blast word that we are so familiar with from Rosh Hashanah. And in that word, I think you might be able to see how the shofar blast is also a call of love, a love song that goes up from the people that recalls this moment in the sea, in the crossing of the sea, when we were able to call God King, Adonai Yimloch Le'olam Va'ed. My hope is that we'll be able to look at each of these verses as we look through we'll see if we get to all 30 of them, each of the verses in Malkhuyot, Zichronot, Shofar, in a new light through the Midrash. And since it's Elul, and since we're mentioning the shofar, and since we found our shofar in our house, since we've all been practicing here, I'm going to end today by just blowing shofar for us all. Okay, let's see how it goes. Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow for the second verse of Malkhuyot.